find seats, that would be great. While we're waiting, for technology to catch up with us, my name is David Bernstein. I'm the Dean of the Pardes Institute for Jewish Studies in Yerushalayim. Pardes is a co-ed Beit Midrash open to the entire spectrum of the Jewish people. It's a place for people who are university graduates and older. We've had numerous students come from Melbourne and from Sydney to Pardes over the years. We now have started in addition to our regular year program, which goes according to the Northern Hemisphere academic year, we've started a Southern Hemisphere summer program and winter program, which is basically December, January, your summer, and in the winter, a 3-week program in July. If people are interested in learning more about that, I'll be happy to speak to you afterwards. The title of this session, I don't know whether you looked at the green sheet or whether you looked at the program. The full program gives the full title, which is the connection between the Shoah and the creation of the State of Israel, a more nuanced approach. And that's what we're going to be doing. And as soon as our technology catches up to us. Okay. Yes?
Yes.
On the screen.
On the screen, touch the screen.
Thank you. I'm not used to a smart board.
Well, most of the time we don't call them smart.
I see. Okay. Okay, so what am I looking at here?
What did you want to?
My UBS, my USB, yes.
I never.
That's good, okay. Okay, great. So, this is what we're going to be discussing. And what I'd like to start with is a quote from President Barack Obama of the United States when he went to Cairo University in June of 2009, early in his first term. I know different people have different opinions about Barack Obama. I'd like to say that one thing that I do admire about Barack Obama is that he has on numerous occasions spoken to audiences and told them what they did not want to hear, which is quite unusual in a political leader in our time. Usually, political leaders play to the audience and tell them exactly what they want to hear. But when he was running for election, he spoke to a group of African Americans and talked about the need for African American fathers to take more responsibility for their families. And when he received the Nobel Peace Prize, which was quite a joke, he honestly said to them, A, he didn't deserve it, and B, that even though he's receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, sometimes war is necessary. And when he went to Cairo University, he said the following: America's strong bonds with Israel are well known. This bond is unbreakable. It is based upon cultural and historical ties. The recognition, the aspiration for Jewish homeland is rooted in a tragic history that cannot be denied. When he's talking about history that cannot be denied, we know what he's talking about here. And then it gets more explicit. Around the world, the Jewish people were persecuted for centuries. Anti-Semitism in Europe culminated in an unprecedented Holocaust. Tomorrow was at Buchenwald, which was part of a network of camps where Jews were enslaved, tortured, shot, and gassed to death by the Third Reich. 6 million Jews were killed, more than the entire Jewish population of Israel today. Denying that fact is baseless, it is ignorant, it is hateful. Threatening Israel with destruction or repeating vile stereotypes about Jews is deeply wrong, and only serves to evoke in the minds of Israelis this most painful of memories, while preventing the peace that the people of this region deserve. Okay? Now, it's interesting, I said that I admire him for saying this of the audience at Cairo University, but it's interesting that when he said this, I and many other people, many other Jews, were not so happy. I mean, I was happy that he actually said these words, but what's not right about this picture? Yes, Shamir.
It contextualizes Israel as being justified only because of the Shoah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Israel exists because of the Shoah. That's the implication of what he said here. And that feeds into this cliche, this notion, this idea, which I would like to contest a little bit, that the state of Israel was established because of guilt feelings due to the Shoah. Okay? I think that is a widespread perception among Jews and among non-Jews. And while there is some truth to this, it's the nuance that we're going to be looking at today. So, on the one hand, modern Zionism does not begin in 1945. Modern Zionism begins as a grassroots movement, the Chovevei Tzion, in the Russian Empire, in Eastern Europe, in the late 1800s. It's given organizational structure by the World Zionist Organization created by Theodor Herzl in 1897 at the First Zionist Congress. There were a series of aliyot that changed the face of Jewish life in Eretz Yisrael. And while there was still an old yishuv there, the new yishuv begins to outnumber it and creates a modern, vibrant society before the Shoah. So we're going to look at a number of things that give us that perspective, that the Zionist movement is not a result of the Shoah. And in fact, there was a state in the making. Okay? 1881, 25,000 Jews we estimate living in Eretz Yisrael. By 1942, which is only 61 years later, there are 400,000 Jews. That's not by natural increase alone. That's because of the aliyot, the first through the fifth aliyot that took place during that time period. The number of Jewish agricultural settlements, which didn't really exist in 1881. In 1919, there were 50 settlements with a population of 12,000. In 1929, as you could see, the number of settlements has more than doubled. The population of Jews living on the land, working in agriculture, has more than tripled. If we look at the cities, okay, in 1881, Tel Aviv had not yet been founded. Okay? Jerusalem had 16,000 Jews. The majority of the population in Jerusalem was Jewish. The old Yishuv contained about 2/3 of the population of Jerusalem in 1881. Haifa had only 300 Jews at this time. In 1939, Tel Aviv was already a city of 150,000. 150,000 Jews. It was a Jewish city. Jerusalem had increased its Jewish population by, 6 times? Between 5 and 6 times. And Haifa had increased the Jewish population by 20 times. This is in a period of, how many years is that? Well, 39 and 19 is 58. In a period of 58 years. But it's more than that. During this time period, what had been created was an infrastructure, first of all, of culture. Modern Hebrew culture develops during this time period, so that by the time of the second Aliyah in the early 1900s, there are already daily newspapers. So what? Who cares about daily newspapers? What's important about daily newspapers? Daily newspapers in Hebrew. Daily newspapers in Hebrew reflect what? It reflects that there was enough of a population that was reading Hebrew. There was a critical mass reading Hebrew. Not only that, but it spreads Hebrew literacy as well. It's a reflection, but it's also a cause. Hebrew theater is already established. The first university was established in when?
The Hebrew University?
No, not the Hebrew University.
Teaching in Hebrew.
What was the first university established in the land of Israel? The Technion. The Technion was established in 1912 or 1913, and when it was established, it was funded by German philanthropists, German Jewish philanthropists, and of course it was established as a scientific institution. And you know the center of European scientific research in the early 1900s was, of course, in Germany, and it was established as a German-speaking institution. And there was a major crisis around this because the Hebrew teachers of Eretz Yisrael went out on strike. And they said, how can we establish an institution of higher learning in Eretz Yisrael, established by Jews, and make it a non-Hebrew speaking institution? Ultimately, the German Balabatim relented, and they agreed that the Technion would be in Hebrew. I mean, they couldn't understand what kind of words can you make up in Hebrew for all of those German scientific terms. German was the equivalent of English in those days. It was the language of the sciences. Nonetheless, that's what happened, and that's why when a second university was created in the early 1920s in Jerusalem, they called it the Hebrew University. There's no mistaking what language of instruction will be in this university. Comes a little later. And there's a growing Hebrew literature that's developing in this country. So there's a modern Hebrew culture that's taking place here. There's which is a very important part of the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement is not only a political movement, as Herzl saw it, right? For Herzl, it would have been okay if we spoke English and French and Russian on the streets, but it was also influenced by thinkers like Achad Ha'am, and for them, it was not about politics only, it was about culture, it was about creating a new Jew.
What year was this? Years?
The daily newspaper's second Aliyah, which is before 1914, 1904 to 1905 to 1914. Hebrew theater is by the 1920s. The university, we said the Technion was 1912-13, and Hebrew University 1923, I believe. And the growing Hebrew literature is also, this is all early 20th century, this is all pre-Shoah. Jewish self-defense had already been developing. HaShomer was the first Jewish self-defense group created in Eretz Yisrael in 1909. Up until then, Jewish agricultural settlements hired Arabs to defend their lands against vandalism and theft, etc. And in 1909, a group of young Jews said, you know what? We need to learn how to defend ourselves. What's fascinating is to look at them and to see how they dressed.
They look like Arabs.
Exactly. They dressed as Arabs. There are other pictures that show them on horseback. You don't really realize that they're Jews, okay? But that was an important part of the Zionist movement as well, taking self-defense into our own hands. The Jewish Legion of World War I. The Haganah was founded in 1921. The Hetzel and Lechi were founded in the 1930s, all before the Shoah. Perhaps most importantly, in terms of the state in the making, is the Balfour Declaration of 1917. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. This was the greatest victory of political Zionism up to this point, because the British Empire in 1917, well, the sun never set on the British Empire, as you well know, right? And so the greatest power in the world was endorsing the idea of a Jewish national home in Palestine. So this was a great victory, but even more significant perhaps is the San Remo Conference at the end of World War I. As part of the Treaty of Versailles that takes place, there are a number of follow-up conferences that take place. One of them is the San Remo Conference. At the San Remo Conference, the League of Nations gives Britain officially the mandate over Palestine. But notice the wording of why they give the British what it is they want the British to do with this mandate. Whereas the principal Allied powers have also agreed that the mandatory should be responsible for putting into effect the declaration originally made on November 2nd, 1917, which means the Balfour Declaration, by the government of His Britannic Majesty and adopted by the said powers, because the Balfour Declaration was adopted by the League of Nations in favor of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. So in other words, the San Remo Conference is the international endorsement that we should create the Jewish national home in Palestine. There's a state in the making. The San Remo Conference, Article 2, the mandatory, meaning the British, shall be responsible for placing the country under such political, administrative, and economic conditions as will secure the establishment of the Jewish national home, as laid down in the preamble that we just read, and the development of self-governing institutions, and also for safeguarding the civil and religious rights of all the inhabitants of Palestine, irrespective of race and religion. Note, the civil and religious rights of all the inhabitants of Palestine, right? It means equality. It means religious freedom. But the word that's not listed with rights for everybody else, you don't see the word national, you don't see the word political, okay? In other words, clearly what they're talking about is that it has to be democratic, there have to be equal rights, but clearly the national rights is going to be for the Jewish national home. Yes?
Where does this document sit in relation to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which invalidated Balfour?
This comes after.
So,
Sykes-Picot is also pre-Balfour. Sykes-Picot is 1916.
yes, so does this invalidate Sykes-Picot, or does Sykes-Picot sit alongside this?
Sykes-Picot is an agreement between England and France about how to divide up the Ottoman Empire.
And retain control over the Suez Canal and all other political...
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
But this comes afterwards, and clearly this supersedes it. Okay? Yes? Shamir.
Were there any other representatives at the San Remo Conference from the Middle East?
It's a very good question. I don't know the answer.
Can you repeat again about what they didn't have? I didn't understand that part.
Yes. All of this is the Jewish national home, okay? In other words, the Jews will have the national rights to Palestine. What Palestine is something to be defined later, okay? Everybody else will have their civil and religious rights protected. Civil rights means equality. Religious rights means freedom of religion.
Yeah.
Okay? That's not the same as national rights. Okay?
So everyone else within the
Jewish national home. Correct. Yes?
I think it's also interesting to see how the mandate gave opportunities to build. So Irganim, like Rehavia, if you come with specific programs, you have the ability to build it. The Jewish people brought everything they can and to show them this is how we start to build Ma'arav Yerushalayim, etc. So they gave opportunity also for the people living to develop themselves.
Absolutely. The point I'm trying to make here is that there is a plan. There is a plan. It's not totally clear what the plan is, but the general direction is pretty clear. Yes?
There are those who would say that 1881 is still pretty recent history,
Yes.
and that even if there was Jewish culture in that area in Palestine in the early 20th century, what about in the century or 2 or 3 or 4 centuries before that, all the Arab inhabitants, did they not have the rights to the land because they were there before Jewish culture flourished in the early 20th century.
Your question is a very good question. The question of who was here first, who deserves things, how far do you go back? This is a very important debate and an unending debate for another session. We're not discussing now the right of the Jews to settle in Eretz Yisrael. That's another question. What I'm trying to say is that for people to make the claim that it's the Shoah that created the state of Israel is to ignore all of this, is to ignore the fact that there was a state in the making along the way. Yes?
But at the same time, when you talk, maybe you don't call it a Shoah, but the first Aliyot came after pogroms in Russia,
Yes.
after, that's how they came. That's why they left.
Anti-Semitism was definitely a factor in the growth of the modern Zionist movement. It was not the only factor. It was uppermost in Herzl's mind. It was not uppermost in Achad Ha'am's mind. It depends which Zionist thinker and leader you're looking at. So it plays a role, it's not the exclusive role. Okay? Okay.
Can we say that it's the straw that
Let's wait and see. Let's wait and see, okay? The San Remo, an appropriate Jewish agency. An appropriate Jewish agency shall be recognized as a public body for the purpose of advising and cooperating with the administration in Palestine. The Zionist organization, so long as its organization and constitution are in the opinion of the mandatory appropriate, shall be recognized as such agency. Meaning, the San Remo Conference is saying that the World Zionist Organization should be working closely together with the British government to create the Jewish national home. Okay. All of this comes to a halt in 1939. There is an Arab revolt that begins in 1936, largely in opposition to the massive fifth aliyah of mostly German refugees, German Jewish refugees, or later Austrian as well, after the rise of Hitler. There's an Arab revolt that lasts 3 years, 1936 to 1939. The British are desperate to solve this problem. On the one hand, they're trying to put down the Arab revolt, and they do so with great brutality. On the other hand, they understand by 1939 that war may be approaching. This is after Munich. It is after Neville Chamberlain has waved, "We have achieved peace in our time," right? Which just tells you how lovers of peace can sometimes delude themselves. We're all lovers of peace, but sometimes peace can be very illusory. By 1939, the British understand Hitler has broken his promise. He's taken over the Sudetenland and then moved into the rest of Czechoslovakia, and they understand war is approaching. Now, war is approaching, and the Middle East is critical for the British war effort. It's critical, first of all, because of the Suez Canal, which links Britain with its most important trading partner, India. It's important because the British Navy in 1912 moved over from coal to oil. And Britain at that time did not know that it had oil in the North Sea. It imported its oil from the Middle East. In other words, if the Germans could manage to sway the Arabs of the Middle East to their side, and there was every indication that they could, Haj Amin el-Husseini, the leader of Palestinian nationalism at the time, went to Berlin, visited with Hitler, and said, "We have a common cause. We want to get the British out, and we want to get the Jews out." All of the anti-colonial feeling in the Arab world was being fanned by the Germans and by the Italian fascists. If they could get control of that oil and deprive Britain of that oil in a future war, British ships could not sail, British tanks could not run, British planes could not fly. And so the British are desperate to find a solution, at least a temporary solution, to Palestine that is going to somehow mend their fences with the Arabs of the Middle East so that at least they won't go over to the Germans and Italians. At least they'll stay neutral if they won't appreciate the British. And they know, on the other hand, that the Jews have no choice in this coming war. The Jews are in their pocket. The Jews can side with the Germans, but the Arabs who control the oil of the Middle East can. And so they issued the British White Paper of 1939. And the British White Paper of 1939 essentially reneges on the Balfour Declaration. It essentially says, that was 1917, this is 1939. They limit to 75,000 the number of Jewish immigrants over the next 5 years with no further Jewish immigration permitted. It guarantees an Arab majority in Palestine. Second, no further Jewish land purchases are allowed in Palestine. Third, Palestine will be independent within 10 years, meaning an Arab state in Palestine will be created in 1949. That is the British White Paper. Now you can understand that for the Jews in Palestine, this was a crushing blow. But you can also understand that the British, facing the onset of war, were desperate to try to keep the Middle East at the very least neutral. And this was part of their effort. So the rise of Hitler and the threat of World War II actually sets back the entire Zionist project. The state in the making is no more in 1939 because of the rise of Hitler and the threat of war. Then comes the war. And with the war, of course, comes the Shoah, the war against the Jews. And the Jewish death toll is greatest in Eastern Europe, which was the most Zionistic communities of Europe. It was the greatest reservoir of potential aliyah. The murder of 90% of Polish Jewry, 90% of Lithuanian Jewry, that was the heartland of the Zionist movement. Those were the largest Zionistic-oriented communities in the world. And so the Shoah actually deals a terrible blow to the Zionist movement in that this potential aliyah will never happen. Not to mention all of the leaders of the Jewish community, including the leaders of the Zionist movement, who were murdered in the Shoah. On the other hand, there is no doubt that this map showing the death toll of the Shoah also plays a role in strengthening Zionism. Because even though it destroys the greatest centers of Zionist activity, at the same time, it also proves the Zionist axiom, which is Jews will never be safe in the diaspora. Mm-hmm. And it does so with such force that communities that had not been so Zionistic are won over to the Zionist cause. And the community that was most significantly won over was the American Jewish community. The largest Jewish community in the world in this time period. It had exceeded that of Poland already. There were about 4.7 million Jews living in the United States in the 1940s. They were about 4% of the American population. They were not an overwhelmingly Zionistic community. But from 1933, the year Hitler comes to power, till 1945, when the war ended, membership in American Zionist organizations quadrupled in 12 years. Case in point, the Reform movement in America. The Reform movement in America in 1932 was anti-Zionist. With the rise of Hitler, it becomes a Zionist movement. But the same was true of many of the Orthodox, who had opposed Zionism, but with the rise of Hitler, many of them are won over to the idea of a Jewish national home in Palestine. Now this is only increased in the immediate aftermath of the war. Because in the immediate aftermath of the war, particularly in Poland, the returning Jews are met with a wave of pogroms. There's a book by Professor Jan Gross of Princeton University called Fear, Anti-Semitism in Poland After Auschwitz, which documents the series of pogroms that murdered approximately 1,000 Jews in the year, in the immediate aftermath, the year after the Nazi retreat from Poland. It's not the year after the war. The Nazis were already being beaten back from Poland. The pogrom started as early as 1944. As Eastern Poland is liberated by the Red Army, there are already attacks on Jews by local Poles. We're not going to get into all the reasons why. That's a whole fascinating discussion. But the point is that the returning Jews are met with great hostility. They flee Poland, those who had survived, largely as a result of the Kielce pogrom, which was the worst of the pogroms, July 4th, 1946, in which about 40 Jews were murdered very, very brutally in what was essentially a blood libel. A Christian child went missing, the Jews were accused, and about 40-some Jews were murdered. Some of them were veterans of the Polish army. So Jews are now leaving Poland, going to DP camps in Germany. These DP camps in Germany become actually centers of Zionist activity. They're learning Hebrew. They're demanding to go to Palestine. The British have kept the white paper intact, in part because there's a new threat to the Middle East coming from Russia, Soviet Union. Cold War immediately follows, hard on the heels of World War II. And so in order to protect their oil interests in the Suez Canal, the British don't relent, and they keep the white paper. U.S. Jewish organizations from 1945 to 1948 raised $100 million for the DPs, the displaced persons, in Germany, and the Yishuv, meaning the Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael. Now, my parents were refugees. They came to the United States in 1946. My mother used to tell me, when we came to the United States, everything cost 5 cents. A loaf of bread cost 5 cents. A quart of milk costs 5 cents, and the New York City subway costs 5 cents. Okay? For those who don't know, the New York City subway today costs $2.50. If you extrapolate what $100 million 1948 dollars is to today, we're probably talking about something like $1 billion. The Jewish community in America at that time was not as well-to-do as the Jewish community is today. But there was an outpouring of giving that reflected this new identification. Now, this did not go unnoticed by the political leaders in America. In 1946, Harry Truman was the President of the United States. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had been the president, elected 4 times. Right? In America, they now have a constitutional amendment that limits a president to 2 terms. He's the only president ever elected 4 times. He was almost a god, certainly an emperor in America. He dies towards the end of World War II. And who is the vice president to step in his very big shoes? An unknown senator from Missouri who happened to be the vice president on the ticket. Harry Truman had to achieve legitimacy. He had come into the presidency not elected as president, but only because of the death of the president. And so therefore, he was looking for electoral success in order to be able to show that he indeed is the legitimate president. In 1946, it was a congressional election year, what they call in America the midterm election. November 1946. Well, call it coincidence. A few weeks before, in October 1946, President Truman gives a Yom Kippur address. In America, I imagine it happens in Australia too, the president sends something right before St. Patrick's Day. He sends a letter to all the Irish Americans. Happy St. Patrick's Day. We're so glad to have you as citizens. You've contributed so much to the country. We love you. You love us. Isn't it great? Happy St. Patrick's Day. And before Columbus Day in America, the same thing is done to the Italian Americans. And before Martin Luther King Day in America, the same thing is done to the African Americans. Erev Yom Kippur, there's usually some similar letter that most of us in America at the time don't pay attention to, because it's one of these pro forma kinds of documents. It's very nice, but is not news. 1946, Erev Yom Kippur, Harry Truman makes news. He issues his greeting to the American Jews, and he tells them that he's in favor of the immediate admission of 100,000 DPs to Palestine and the partition of Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. He did this over the objections of the State Department, the Foreign Office. He did it over the objections of the Defense Department. The reasons why Harry Truman did it are numerous. He himself had a very close Jewish friend and business partner by the name of Jacobson. And if you read the prime ministers, you'll see that there's a great story there about that. He had a great sympathy for the Zionist movement, but there's no doubt that as a political leader, facing his first electoral test a month later, this would also work to his advantage if the Jews were willing to raise $100,1946 for this cause. Then being behind this cause was politically a very astute thing for him to do. And so Harry Truman endorses this idea of a Jewish national home. American Jewish support then was critical for the creation of the State of Israel. And it was indeed very much influenced by the Nazi rise to power and the Shoah. So, what are our conclusions? Number one, the historical trajectory until the rise of Hitler was for the Balfour Declaration to be implemented. And as of 1933, a Jewish state was in the making. British fear of Arab support for the Axis was an important factor that led them to renege on the Balfour Declaration with the White Paper of 1939 and set back the Zionist movement. The Shoah destroyed the most important Zionist communities in the diaspora and their potential aliyah, but created in the US and elsewhere Jewish communities that became much more pro-Zionist than ever before as a result of vindicating the basic Zionist axiom. And last, this new active pro-Zionism of the US Jewish community may very well have played a critical role in President Truman's strong support of partition, that is, the creation of an independent Jewish state. So, my purpose has not been to say there is no connection between the Shoah and the creation of the State of Israel. My purpose is to give it a more nuanced inflection, and for us to understand that the Shoah both dealt a terrible blow to Zionism, as well as helped the Zionist movement, and for us to understand that the Zionist movement had already created a state in the making, a modern Hebrew culture, and a very strong presence in the land of Israel well before the Shoah took place. But then there is the emotional side to this, which cannot be denied. The Knesset in Israel in the early 1950s decided to make a day to commemorate the Shoah. And there was a debate in the Knesset when to do it. And some of the leaders, including Menachem Begin, favored Tisha B'Av, the date in which we commemorate Jewish catastrophes in history. Ultimately, that was not approved, but rather the date chosen was the 28th day of Nisan. Why was that date chosen? They wanted to tie it to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. There was a very strong feeling in Israel of identification with the partisans and with the resistance fighters. And in those days, not only in Israel, but also in the diaspora, there was a lot of squeamish feeling about going as sheep to the slaughter, and people focused very much on Yom HaShoah v'ha-Gvura. And by Gvura, they meant the taking up of arms. They didn't mean the personal Gvura that we understand much more today, of a parent sacrificing themselves to save a child or to save an elderly parent. That wasn't part of the narrative at that time. So Yom HaShoah, those of you who've been in Israel this time of year know, Yom HaShoah comes out after Pesach and a week before Yom HaAtzmaut, Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut. And the juxtaposition is not by chance. In other words, there was this idea, Mishoah l'Tkuma, that we should view things in those ways, and it's a very, very powerful message. I've tried to decouple it a little bit and help us understand that it's an oversimplification. But having said that, it does have a certain emotional power, which can't be denied. This is, some of you may recognize this. Anybody recognize it?
Yeah, the entrance of Yad La'elet in Yad Vashem.
Absolutely. The Children's Memorial at Yad Vashem, the entrance is of Uziel. Uziel was a young boy who was murdered in the Shoah, and his parents survived. His parents went to America after the war. They prospered in California. They became well-to-do, and they were the ones who gave the money for the Children's Memorial, and they did it in memory of their son, Uziel, who was killed in the Shoah. Now, I want to show you a second photograph, but I don't have it. I don't have it. And that is when I was serving in Miluim in the reserves in the Israeli army. I was stationed, I didn't do anything very heroic, don't worry. No other army in the world would have taken me, but in those days they took 30-year-old people. So I say to people, and people ask me about my basic training, I said I did more standing than running. But in any case, part of my Miluim, every year I would go down to Machane Ramon. Some of you may know Machane Ramon, right outside of Mitzpeh Ramon in the Negev. Machane Ramon is the largest F-16 Air Force base in Israel. And my job was to sit in a watchtower, go around in a jeep around the perimeter, a 40-kilometer perimeter of this enormous base. And like every good Israeli army base, there was a shul. When I went into the shul for the first time, I saw the same portrait of Uziel. That is, the family had given money to Yad Vashem. But now this picture of Uziel, which was not as beautifully carved in stone, it was just a picture and a plaque, was in quite a different context. Of course, Uziel represents Jewish helplessness. The shul on the base of Machane Ramon represented a transition from Jewish helplessness to the ability of Jews to defend themselves. This picture to me epitomizes Jewish helplessness. The Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, where this picture was taken after the revolt or in the course of the revolt, were for the most part helpless. And I want to conclude with, when I see this picture, I don't only think about Jewish helplessness, I also think about how things have changed. And I want to share a story with you that took place about 25 years ago. I was then director of Midrashat Lindenbaum. I was in Yerushalayim. I was traveling, recruiting. I was in Los Angeles, and I was in the LAX airport. I was between flights, and I sat myself down to have a cup of tea in the cafeteria.
Presenters, please start wrapping up your sessions and move to the Rose Hall for lunch. For anyone that is interested, there is mincha in the shul at 1 o'clock. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm in the LAX airport. I'm sitting with my cup of tea, quietly. It's very nice, and then all of a sudden it starts to fill up. It fills up, and more people are coming in. And all of a sudden I see people coming to my table, and there are 3 men in uniform. They are Marine Air Force pilots. There's a large Marine Air Force base next to Los Angeles, Southern California. I don't know if you know, the Marines think they're the best. They're the elite of the elite. They're so elite they don't rely on the regular Air Force, they have to have their own Air Force. So these 3 pilots with their wings come over with their trays, and they ask, can we sit down? And I say, sure. They sit down with me at this table for 4, the 3 of them and me. Each one of them is ramrod straight, 6 feet something, you know. And they sit down with this little Jew, and one of them says to me, how you doing? Because see, in America, outside of New York, the people are friendly. I come from New York, so I can say it. He said, how you doing? I said, I'm fine. How are you?
You had your kippah on?
Yes. He said, great. He says, where are you from? I said, I'm from Jerusalem. He said to me, Jerusalem? I said, yes. He said, this is a Marine Air Force pilot. He says, man, what I wouldn't give to fly with one of your squadrons. I thought of this picture. Thank you very much.